Great. So first I want to start off by saying that we are working with a design group. So we've got some of the logos up here, but not everyone. So we've got, I think, Wisconsin DOT has also jumped on board with us, and NiSource, and CN Railroad, I think, recently joined us as well. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. There we go. So one of the first things that we've accomplished right off the bat is to kind of first just figure out what is the purpose of this system that we're putting together. So we put together this statement. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but basically we see this as a repository for tracking all of our information. There's also going to be to facilitate the conservation partnerships, so really getting ourselves within our organizations to start working together more. So by putting your data in, we can collaborate. And we want to help to avoid any kind of future listing. So this is our kind of first stab at core purpose. And then along those lines, sort of putting on my sales hat. So these are some of the benefits that you can get from joining and being a part of the database system. That would be to track progress, to work on, again, collaboration, as I said before, seeing where those synergies are between organizations, physically in the landscape where your rights of ways may overlap. So reporting out. So we've got the MCD is the main thing right now. That's the Monarch Conservation Database. And so we want to, so that's Fish and Wildlife Service has developed this database to basically see how much impact different sectors are having on the ground to avoid a future listing. And so we want to contribute to that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There's also the CCAA that's not mentioned here, but that's obviously an important piece of our reporting out. And then there's the pollinator scorecard, and so that'll be a huge component of making sure that anything that we want to be capturing, that goes into the database, that you have mobile tools to do that, and that you can see the results of that. And then being able to communicate with the public, we think, is another important thing, and so we'll talk a little bit about things like dashboards for helping to do that. And then obviously managing your conservation goals. So setting those goals and seeing how well you're coming along to achieve those goals. Okay, I'm going to step back for a minute here and go back into the MCD. So while the database is still under development, we have a temporary reporting system, and it's a simple spreadsheet in order to collect some of your core data, just about how many acres you have, that you can put towards the database to show where you have habitat on the ground, to help to communicate how much work is being done. So there's a due date for this. You should have already seen in your inboxes emails about this, but we have this template out there. It's fortunately, it's a pretty simple template. So we've taken what the Fish and Wildlife Service is requiring of you. We've tried to distill it down for rights of way to make it much easier to accomplish this task. This spreadsheet that you see up here encompasses almost the entire your reporting request. And a lot of this is so you can select your drop downs for what land use category your rights of way occur within, and then that auto populates things like the density of milkweed. So we think this is a pretty easy lift, but the deadline is obviously very short. We're talking about next week. If your data is super clean and you can get it to us shortly after that, we'll probably accept it as well, but know that this is what we're working from. Great. So some of the anticipated products that we're looking at here is a non-spatial web interface, and then also a map interface for collecting your data. So the non-spatial would really be for pulling in new users, registering those users, and then the map interface will be for direct use with spatial data. Like I said before, there'll be both a public interface and a non-public interface where you can look at your private organization data. I'm going to keep zipping along because I have a lot here. Okay, so without getting too deep into the nuts and bolts here, one thing we're hoping to do, so this is the basic system layout from the way we're looking at it currently. This is the system we have in place at Field Museum, and we're replicating that on UIC servers. Just a quick show of hands, how many folks are currently using Esri products, so ArcGIS? Okay, and then how many folks who don't know or do not use Esri products? 0, amazing. Oh, maybe 1. Okay, that's great. So we know that security is important, so we'll have that in a secure SQL Server database, and there will be 3 types of interfaces, I said. So there's the open access for the public, and then we'll have private access where you're seeing only your data and anyone that you invite to join that, and then the web interface mostly for reporting. Great, so just some quick terminology for how we're looking at how the data will be stored. One is it will have your Centerlines. We know that's how most organizations have most of their rights-of-way data is based on the Centerline. But from that, we can derive what's called the operational area, and that's sort of your fence-to-fence full property boundaries. Within that, in blue, is what we're calling the management area. So this is mostly be if you have IVM that you're putting in practice, it would be captured at this scale, this within management areas. Conservation sites is what we're calling areas that that would be where you have more targeted or more where you're really focusing on restoring some really high quality sites. And so that's where you might be doing plantings and burns. And then we have this third category that it would just mostly be for internal use for indicating where you may have invasive species, not something that we'd be reporting out. It'd be more for your own use within your organization. So this, in addition to capturing all this data, we're also trying to create some tools that would be helpful for converting things like your Centerlines. So looking up here in the top left, that's what typically people have, and by being able to use some GIS tools, we can estimate what those distances are from the center line to the 2 roadways, and if we're looking at an interstate system, put that into the attribute information and really run a model from that to come up with what the entire, an estimate really for what that habitat areas, what they look like in terms of creating polygons. Then we could go through and refine that further, figure out how much of it is of different types of land cover to really start to make an estimate of how much that is habitat that could be looked at as for monarchs. This is doing a quick, using a model like that to look at voltage by power. So this is actually off the, just off Esri's public site. So I'm not showing anyone's data here that's been provided to us, but this is just in the public domain. But by listing out by voltage class, we can estimate what those corridor widths are. Just a starting point, and then maybe you'd go through with some GIS interns to help clean that up. A couple of, so we've got different interfaces that we can use. So this would be like one of those interfaces where you have kind of your private access to your data. So this is, oh boy. Let's see. Okay, so this would be showing you what your private data looks like through your interface, and this can be fully specialized, but this is just a quick look at what an interface could look like for both importing your data and looking at individual records, zooming in and working with the data. And you can set goals and so forth. And then this is really similar, but this is be like what you can carry around on a tablet in order to carry with you some of the information that you might need to answer in the field. So that would be like the pollinator scorecard type information. And then really exciting, so kind of more on the public interface would be looking at dashboards. And so I'm sure we don't have time for this, but this is an interactive map. You can click on it. You can get the stats for each of the different states. So kind of map on the left there is kind of showing you for IVM, integrated vegetation management, how many acres we have by county. And so again, then we're not divulging actual locations of sites, but we're showing how much there is by county across all sectors. I don't have railroads in here, and this is just a quick look at some of the sort of public domain data, but you can see there's also like I don't know if you can see my cursor. There's also a pie chart here that can kind of give you breakdown by industry. So there are different ways to look at the data. And so one of the things we'll want to ask, I think we have a flip chart over here. We're hoping you can write down any ideas you may have of certain metrics that might be useful to see on a public interface like this. And other ways to kind of look at the data that we might not be thinking of. And then how are we on time? 1 minute, okay. So also things that we're doing, this is kind of phase 2 down the road. We want to start to look at prioritization. And I know a lot of folks are looking at prioritization in different ways, and this is just kind of an additional way to look at it. But looking at those sort of core breeding areas, and then zooming in on areas where we know there's sort of nectar repositories and areas that you want to connect to each other. We can use those, we can use what's in the top left here of showing the least cost path from nectar resources of one site to another, and what areas can the monarchs easily get through for vegetation wise, and then where are there bottlenecks and problems that rights of ways might be able to address that. So this is a poster I presented last year in Washington, DC to this group. So that's all, I think. Yeah, but yeah, and timeline, I mean, we want to have these systems up in place so that this summer we can be collecting, or spring we can be collecting these data and getting them into the system. So that's all.
Great, thanks, Mark. Any questions? Any questions for Mark with database?
Hopefully just a real quick one, Mark. Are there any limitations on the habitat or property we could enter into this? In other words, what about those that are required by regulation, like a mitigation site, versus those that are strictly voluntary?
Yeah, we'd want you to be able to capture both. Yeah, so yeah, all of the above, and then yeah, having flags within the database to be able to designate between the two would be kind of how we'd handle that.
Okay, because on a lot of habitat metrics or databases, it's always important to know what's voluntary versus what was required, and I think going down the road that'll be an important message. So thanks.
Yeah, and actually, so of those two maps that I had up there, I think I forgot to mention, the one on the right was looking at like individual sites where there's that more targeted, really focused, high quality work, versus like the entire rights of way, where we're looking more at like IBM practices. So that's why we had the kind of two map.
And this is just newer right 2014 going forward?
Yeah, and I mean, and all of this is totally customized. Just how we were kind of looking at the system. Yeah, right.
Just to clarify your question there, Tim, so the monarch conservation database that the Fish and Wildlife Service has, that is the 2014 and beyond, and potentially, you know, this database could capture other sites.
What is the resolution of the data that you're pulling in now? In there, is that like a 30 meter, or what is it at?
Okay, so are you referring to the vector data or to the last analysis I was showing there with the kind of corridors?
With the vector data, the kind of the basic layers, because you go from kind of looking at it by county level or something like that versus the prioritization of new habitat. We've had, you know, we've done work to figure out the resolution of the data layers and probably needing to pull in state-specific data layers versus national land cover types.
Yeah, so that's obviously an important consideration. We'll have to work individually with each organization to see what their data looks like. This public data that we were pulling down is actually pretty darn accurate. It's kind of scary. I'm not sure how they were able to obtain it, but then, yeah, at that point, then being able to map out the full corridor width, obviously we're just going to have more automated tools, and someone would need to go through and refine that data, and then we can really look and see what's in those rights of ways, using the same exact data that the Fish and Wildlife Service is using. So their raster data set is a 30 meter based on the NLCD and also Tiger and other census block data that they're pulling into it. So that's what we would use for that assessment of kind of what's there currently.
Okay, thanks.
And then yeah, individual organizations could use things like, you know, high quality LiDAR to really improve what they're seeing on the ground, but that would be our sort of level of effort that we'd be able to put at it.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. And maybe one other thing I would just add, excuse me, is I know this has been a discussion and question we've gotten, particularly from some of the utilities in the past, is there's some concern about providing operational data. And so when Mark was providing those kind of layers or scales, there is some consideration that you don't necessarily have to provide operational data. You just want to provide kind of the vegetation management areas or habitat sites, that would be sufficient too. So there's intended to be a lot of flexibility in terms of how you're reporting the data and potentially sharing it with others.